movie Red Dawn opened in U.S. theaters days ago, ushered in by controversy over its original portrayal of Chinese, later changed to North Korean forces invading Spokane, Washington. Hello and welcome to another edition of Across America Talk. As usual, I'm joined by China Daily's Chen, Weihua, and Zhou, Boris. Let's first start with Weihua. I know you've watched Red Dawn the first day it hits the theater. Tell us what took you there and give us some background of why the identity of the invading army changed from Chinese to North Korean.
You know, I came to the U.S. this time in 2009, and actually after just a few months, there was really a sort of a controversial, protest among the Chinese community for the remake of Red Dawn. You know, the original one was the Soviet army invading the U.S., and now at the time it was changing to the Chinese invading the U.S. So the Chinese, they always feel, there is such a force in the U.S. which try to demonize China, and they think this is just a show of that sort of anti-China sentiment. So they protested, and actually the Hollywood, MGM, they finally decided, I think, the China market is way too important. It's not worth it probably to upset China with one movie, because that could mean you're going to lose the market for quite a while, and that's very important, for their bottom line, financial bottom line. So they finally decided to pick North Korea as the invading army. I think that's sad too. My understanding is, there's a lot of misunderstanding between China and the U.S., and there's actually more misunderstanding between U.S. and the North Korea. So you're not really helping, but I thought it would be more fun, if you want to entertain people, how about have the Canadian or maybe the Mexican? They are friendly neighbors of the U.S. invading the United States.
But the change is probably a wise move, because we have to consider the fact that the North American box office has stayed pretty gloomy in the past decade, with admissions falling down. According to the Motion Picture Association of America, in 2011, its box office grew by 35% to over $2 billion, and the number of cinema screens have doubled in 5 years to about 11,000. These, all these factors is what MGM has to consider.
Mm-hmm. Although I wonder if we won't reach a point in the not too distant future where a Chinese audience will be trusted to see a movie like this and laugh it off as kind of the ridiculous spectacle that it is. I personally feel that probably would have been the reaction on the part of individuals. But I understand the government is sensitive about, of course, its portrayal.
Also, Weihua, do you agree that even a sci-fi portrayal of China being invaded is not allowed?
Well, I would think so. I think, I don't know, it's because the Chinese lack of a sense of humor. It's just they cannot, I don't know, you remember when this Mission Impossible 3 came out and showed a moment of the Chinese actually near Shanghai and hanging out clothing outside the window. The Chinese feel it's a negative image of China, so they think it's bad. In all other countries, in Japan, you have a movie I watched a long time ago about Japan sinking. Japan disappeared after a massive earthquake. Here in the U.S., we have all kinds of. I'm actually for a while was a huge fan of the Sci-Fi Channel.
How many times has New York been destroyed?
New York disappeared. By snowstorm, by sort of all kind of natural disaster, maybe probably terrorists or whatever. Right. So this is just entertainment. I think we should just literally take it as entertainment. We should, but I think the Chinese probably took it too seriously. I think the only reason I could find is you have to look back the history. Because the Chinese is always being invaded. Right. Throughout the modern history, so you don't want to talk about this. This is like the old wounds. You don't want to mention And so that's probably a very different psychology.
But I can tell you, just as an aside, having lived in Russia for several years and knowing the reaction that still persists in movies nowadays. When we went from, the Soviets as, perennial bad guys in movies. And I can tell you, Russian movies, even from the Soviet period, or even especially from the Soviet period, typically did not portray the American military as bumbling idiots in the way that we sort of did sometimes with other countries, militaries. But there was sort of a more, I wouldn't say nuance, but some of the acting wasn't bad in some of these movies in Russia. But nowadays, it's uniformly Russian mafia is sort of the kind of go-to stereotype in most Hollywood movies. And I think, unfortunately, as long as one's country and culture are going to be depicted in mainstream American films, you're probably going to have to get used to a certain, tiresome portrayal. And I kind of look forward to the day when, Chinese audiences just sort of roll their eyes and say, no thanks, I'm not even interested.
If you see too much an anti-China sentiment in movies produced in the U.S., would that affect your feelings toward China?
Oh, not at all. I mean, for one thing, I'm familiar with the country, and I think anyone who goes to a movie, it probably breaks down. I don't want to oversimplify things. I don't know the mind of a movie-going audience well enough to say this definitively, but I would imagine that it sort of breaks down this way. People who are sophisticated enough to understand the reality of, in this case, U.S.-Chinese relations do not match what they're going to see on screen. And then other people who sort of don't even really think about it very much at all. It could be whether it's, the Chinese army, this North Korean army, Russian army, or any other military force opposing Uncle Sam probably doesn't even really register.
All right, thank you so much for joining us, and that's all for this week's edition of Across America Talk. I'm Yuhan Liu. For more information, please go to ChinaDailyUSA.com.
How many times has New York been destroyed?
Disappeared, by snowstorm, by sort of all kind of nature disaster, and probably terrorists or whatever. So.